terrific. I'm excited to get this webinar started. Welcome and thank you to all the attendees for joining. My name is Sunil Rajaraman. I am the head of marketing at Replicon, and we're here today to discuss how, and it's more complicated than most business owners think. So as I'm sure many of you are affected by it, we're excited to share what we've learned so far today. Next slide, please. So we thought we would start on a lighter note. I'm a huge fan of Dilbert comics. We'll let this one process for a second. This seemed particularly relevant to the audience today. So we'll start off with a little bit of a laugh, and we'll give it a few seconds for you to read this one. But in all seriousness, let's move to the next slide. And so what do we want to cover today? So we wanted to discuss what overtime is and why it's so difficult for organizations to comply with the new overtime rules, because as you know, a major change was made. We want you to get an understanding as to why the change actually happened and what specifically the update is, how it's going to affect you as a business owner, and what you can do to start planning for that change. And why are we doing this? For us, we've been in the time tracking business for 20 years now, and it relates to rule changes. And so we've taken a particular interest in the new overtime rule, and subject matter experts on this. So we look forward to helping you understand the implications for your business. Next slide, please. So a bit of house. As I'm sure you're already aware, everybody is on mute right now during the presentation, but we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. You can submit your questions anytime using GoToWebinar, using the questions text box located on the right. And we are going to take a brief poll presentation, and we really appreciate your response to that poll. So thank you in advance for your help there. And with that, let's get into the content. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what overtime is. Okay, so effectively, overtime is additional compensation for any hours worked over what is considered to be a regular work week of 40 hours, or depending on which state you're in, 8 hours per day is the threshold before overtime is paid out. Generally speaking, overtime is paid out at 1.5 times the regular pay rate. However, there are different states that have different regulations on this, which we will get into later. Employees who are eligible for overtime are called non-exempt employees. Those who are not eligible for overtime are called exempt employees. And we'll add a build effect here. There's generally 3 things that need to be considered when determining whether someone is an exempt versus a non-exempt employee. There's the salary level test, which we're going to get into specifically later what that salary level is. But you are considered an exempt employee if you are paid above a certain salary threshold as determined by the Department of Labor. There's also a salary basis test, which is to say that if your salary is based on a number of hours worked, then you could not, in many cases, be not eligible or be eligible for overtime if it's based on the number of hours that you're worked. And also, what are your specific duties as a manager within your company? If you have the input into the job or other professional administrative duties, you could be considered exempt. So overtime is really difficult for organizations because of all of these little moving parts that go into it. And why is it so difficult to comply with? It's basically a major impact to litigation for organizations. It's in addition to the increased labor cost associated with overtime. There's the $3.6 billion in in labor litigations that, according to narrow consulting research, has had obviously a drastic impact on organizations. Just litigation alone is significant. Next slide, please. And so let's dig into a little bit more of the complexities as to why it's so difficult to deal with overtime. Many of which you're familiar with. We already talked about the litigation, but if you have manual processes around dealing with time and attendance, it gets even more complicated because overtime rules can be complex and subjective, and so the consistent application of overtime rules across all people and all locations within your organization can be difficult because of the state-by-state rules associated with it. What's added an additional wrinkle to things, and I say this as the former CEO of an on-demand company, the on-demand workforce has totally changed things and how people work, using mobile applications, et cetera. So now let's dig into, a sample of a few states, just to show you how difficult state-by-state compliance is. We decided to take a look at 5 states. We're not going to go over every single state in this call, but California and New York are often referred to as the horns of the bull because they're sort of leading in many of these laws. But just to give you some perspective, in California there's a daily hours threshold of 8. And between 8 and 12, workers are paid out at a time and a half. But over 12 in a day, workers are paid double time. The weekly hours threshold in California is 40 hours a week. But let's just say somebody's working a 7-day work week. So that could be Monday through Sunday, or Tuesday through Monday. On that 7th day, on day 8. On the 7th day, that entire 8-hour day, the employee is eligible for time and a half that entire day, and over 8, they're eligible for double time. New York, the way it's done is just a basic weekly hours threshold of 40 hours a week, and Puerto Rico, we can go through that one. Tennessee, sort of subject to federal laws, which is why you see an NA there. In Colorado, another example of actually the daily hours threshold there is 12 hours a day. And they also do have a weekly hours threshold of 40 hours a week, but that could be done 12, 12, 12, and 4. So we just show the slide to show you that if you have workers in many different states, some of whom are reflected here, it can get complicated really, really fast. Next slide, please. As it relates to wage and hour cases, overtime was the most, and it affects 42% of wage and hour allegations. So it's a big deal. Missed meal breaks comes in at 2nd, with minimum wage coming at 3rd. So this is sort of another reason why you should care. Next slide, please. But even more staggering, overtime, basically plays a factor in 90% of cases where back wages are paid out. So you see pure overtime cases come in at around 65%, but cases that have an overtime and minimum wage, another 25%. So if there's a back wage case involved or a settlement involved of some sort, complying with overtime rules is an issue in these cases. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's get into why. We get that, hopefully we haven't scared you too much, but you get that it is a logistical nightmare. There's complexities to deal with these overtime rules, but why are we doing it? So the thought is that are sort of in limbo with the way that they're classified, and the thought is it really forces employers' hands to think about whether workers are full-time or sort of exempt or not exempt, and it's been a long time since the rules have been visited, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but this really is to shift power back into workers' hands and really force employers to think about how they want to classify workers, and thus improving work-life balance and decreasing overtime worked, for folks who shouldn't be in that bucket. But it has another sort of factor associated with it, which is it also forces employers to think about how they want to spread work, thus increasing people who are participating in the active workforce in this country. So once you work with someone and then they start qualifying for 1.5x, or in the state of California 2x overtime in some cases, do you continue to push workers to that limit, or do you think about spreading the work out to other skilled people, and thus spreading out the workforce but increasing workers' health and productivity? So these are some of the considerations, and it's a really meant to be a worker-friendly law. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, wow, I mean, it has been a long time since this has really truly been visited by the government. The last change to the threshold was done in 2004, but between 1970, and now, I mean, just basically there's only been one change. The exemption was originally meant for highly paid workers but over the years there's been erosion in the salary threshold. So this salary threshold provides, prior to the change, provides overtime protections to just 7% of full-time salaried workers today, based on their pay, compared with the 62% in 1975. Another leading cause of litigation, exempt status abuse and a lot of misclassification over the years, and this touches on an earlier point I made, and because of the subjectivity involved, it's just it really forces employers to be less ambiguous about the classification of workers, and this is needed as sometimes even workers earning less than the poverty level line for a family of 4 may earn too much to automatically qualify for overtime at $455 per week, which is effectively what the current threshold protects. So what is the change exactly? The new overtime rule is going to affect 4.2 million workers. So the salary threshold has been doubled from $455 a week to $913 per week. The effective date is December 1st, 2016. So the $455 a week translates to $23,600. The new threshold is $47,476 per year. So it's a significant change, but perhaps more important than this, that the salary threshold is going to be revisited every 3 years now to avoid what happened in the past, which is the along the duties test, which we touched on earlier. So that is to say that some of the managerial oversight and the influence that certain workers have over the exempt and non-exempt status of others, that is still an important factor that determines exempt versus non-exempt status. We could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the Department of Labor set employers back around $1.5 billion annually, which is obviously a significant amount, with 1.2 of that being the increase in overtime pay, but $300 million in corresponding administrative costs. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, that's a lot, and that is why sort of having manual processes in place, et cetera, a lot of employers are going to have to revisit that, staff accordingly, use software tools accordingly to basically manage this across, especially if you have interstate commerce, interstate workforce. The Department of Labor also projects that, while 4.2 million workers are going to be directly affected by the change, another 8.9 million will be indirectly affected because there will be less ambiguity around their exempt and not. So a lot of people are going to be, affected by this. And for perspective, that's a very significant chunk of the active labor workforce in this country. So, next slide, please. So, in response to the new overtime rule, you basically have some options that you can evaluate, right? So you can basically pay time and a half for overtime work. You can look at your workforce and decide on a case-by-case basis whether it just actually makes sense, given the amount of hours people are working, to raise their salaries above the new threshold, thus changing the status of workers. Or, you can limit the amount of hours that individual workers work to about 40 per week and spread out work across new employers, or some combination of the above. But this is ultimately you as an employer, the math that you're going to have to do, however you decide to do it, to ultimately figure out, hey, based on what's going on, I've got to reclassify people, et cetera, and that's basically what it comes down to. Next slide, please. All right, so now we are at the poll portion of our presentation. I promised we would do a quick poll here. Parthosh and Vivek, who are administering this, will pull up the poll. There it is. We are curious to hear of the attendees. Select one of the responses. What sort of impact, based on what we've said so far, will the overtime rule have on your business? I'm going to pause for 30 seconds, allow you to answer, and we really sincerely appreciate your response. And I'm going to go on mute for that 30 seconds. Are, and I think the category that actually surprises me the most is the do not know. And do not know can probably be bucketed, and it will have some sort of impact, but only a small percentage of, and we have quite a few attendees, only 5% say it will not have an impact. That's fascinating. So very curious to hear from the folks who are in the do not know bucket after the call, and we'll follow up directly with you. Why there might be some ambiguity. So now let's move on to what you should do. Okay, so we want to make this very actionable for you, and if we could talk about that. Yeah. So the first thing you need to do is you need to review current employees' hours and salaries. First thing is that you'll need to look at this ahead of the new overtime rules taking effect, which again is December 1st. See who's on the cusp of the salary threshold. Look at the number of hours that people are working, which will determine whether or not they could be reclassified as a non-exempt employee, and carefully evaluate the cost of retaining employees as exempt. Next, you need to understand the costs that extend beyond payroll. So that means don't immediately sort of increase salaries above the ceiling. You may be able to meet the minimum salary now, but will you be able to keep up as the number goes? So as your business grows, how is that going to affect you? Any changes to an employee's salary could affect what benefits he or she has and what it means for your overall payroll costs. So you need to analyze and start running what-if scenarios before you roll out a plan, and understand the full implications before you pull that switch. Just consider the issues with reclassification when someone loses benefits that are no longer mandatory, as well as the employee morale, which could be significantly impacted. Reevaluating your employee handbook and company policies is something I just cannot, emphasize enough as something that's going to be a direct impact of this. So in many cases, business, state, and local regulations for something, you could automatically fall, it would automatically fall back to the company policy in the handbook. So consistent application of policy is really critical here. Look at what your policies are now and how you are managing them, and consider the effects of telecommuting and remote contingent workforce while formulating this policy, which is some of the on-demand stuff I was talking about earlier. Then, after you evaluate your handbook, you're obviously going to need to train your workforce about the changes before you roll anything out. Make them aware of the upcoming changes to the regulations, how it affects the business, get their buy-in on the changes, and really keep them in the loop, and ambiguity, and that you're transparent with the workforce. And last thing you want to be stuck with, and then the fastest way to do that is to have things just be a surprise. So we encourage you not to be a surprise. Train the employees, supervisors, etc. Keep middle management and execs available of the changes too. Make the changes from the top down. Can't emphasize that enough. But also start tracking your exempt employees too. So there have been a lot of discussion about this, and there are experts who are pointing to the fact that we need to start including the exempt employees into getting visibility into their attendance and productivity metrics. Misclassification has been crazy. So with the new rules, these issues are aligned between exempt and non-exempt. It's just every 3 years. Look at the next automatic threshold updates, stay up to date on that, and you need all of the data. And I should just point out at this point of the presentation that obviously Replicon is sort of not in the business of providing professional legal advice, but this is the best advice we can give you that every workforce should apply to, and we obviously encourage you to, as you visit exempt, non-exempt status, obviously lean on trusted legal resources. That's next slide, please. So this is the portion of the presentation where, before the Q&A, we just wanted to give a quick plug for Replicon and how we could potentially help you. I will keep this part brief so that we can get to the Q&A, but our mission is very, very simple. I mean, we help businesses capture, manage, and just in general, keep track of time to help them successfully grow their organizations. Next slide, please. And we try to make this as hassle-free as possible for our customers, and tying it back into the huge amount of administrative costs that will be the 300 million or so that the Department of Labor expects will affect businesses annually. We help you basically mitigate that through clean user interface. We've worked with thousands of customers over the year to enhance and perfect that interface, including companies like Facebook and Apple. And we are really focused on that mobile diversified workforce and a global workforce. So we can help you with a lot of the issues that you're going to face. And we'll work with you on working within your business processes so that you don't have to bend over backwards to sort of affect these rules and changes within your organization. And global compliance, union contracts, specific invoicing, and project tracking needs, we can help that. So we've been in this business for a long time. We're confident we can help. Next slide, please. And the last slide, the last Replicon plug slide I would give you is, and if Parthos and Vivek can just cycle through the build effects of this very quickly. We obviously have a world-class mobile app, but really, the ease of use is something that our customers tout. We can help you with this overtime issue, scheduling better, managing overtime costs. We can give you real-time visibility into the overtime costs, and really give you in the now notification and flag employees who are approaching these thresholds to take proactive action and make it easier for you to manage your business. and we built a large-scale compliance library, and any process requirements that you need or that your organization faces, this is something that we can help with. And that ends the presentation. I'd like to move now to the Q&A portion, and we'll go from there. Thanks everyone for your time. Parthosh, Vivek, I didn't know if we wanted to open it up via phone or question, but you can send me a chat to let me know how we should proceed. I'll give a few seconds here.
Still, all attendees are on mute, and we are sending across the questions to you. You can just access them on your GoToWebinar panel.
Great. I am seeing questions come in, which is wonderful. One question we have come through is time tracking needed for exempt and salaried employees? The answer to that is yes. I mean, you should be tracking given the new rules. It's our recommendation, as a company that's been in the time tracking business for a long time, we recommend that, the best way to put it is we recommend that you track time for all employees, just to have it, and that you as a business to that. Another question, that has, I'll finish the thread on that question. Many employers do not currently track the number, but if you don't track these employees, hours, yeah, you should do so immediately. Time tracking helps you with, sort of intelligence on how employees spend their time. I'd sort of addressed that one already. Okay, so next question, does the FLSA and the Department of Labor's proposed overtime rule for white-collar workers apply to state or local government workers? Yes, state and local government employers are subject to the FLSA and the department's proposed regulations concerning white-collar employees, and that I can state that in no ambiguous terms. That's a requirement. Okay, another question coming through here. This is good. Is there still a chance that the overtime rules will, that there's been a backlash from various parties on the details? And so there have been a number of senators and industry experts in higher education, small business, and retail who have been against the overtime rules. However, the new overtime rule lacks a veto-proof majority. We recommend that organizations take the necessary steps to prepare now for the changes, as we highlighted in the steps listed during our webinar. If you'd like to discuss the steps in more detail, I mean, we will connect with you after, and we're also happy to schedule like a one-on-one session or whatever you see fit. And I actually just do want to say to everyone who's on the call right now, we will reach out to you individually anyway, just to get a sense of your feedback on the webinar and how things will affect you and what we can do for future webinars on this subject. What can a business do to avoid becoming a target of an employee lawsuit or a Department of Labor audit? Okay, well, that one's an easy one. The best thing you can do is, stop tracking processes manually and put the technology infrastructure in place to manage your business correctly. This is, whether it's Replicon, whatever other tools you're using, compliance using technology tools is your path to avoid any sort of litigation or anything of that nature. I highly recommend putting that technology infrastructure in place so that you can be compliant. So another question that's come through is, are there any exemptions from the FLSA or the department's proposed overtime rule for white-collar workers, like for small businesses and not-for-profits? And what I'm hearing here is, unfortunately, no. The FLSA does not provide an exemption for small businesses or not-for-profits. Generally, the FLSA and the proposed rule apply to employees of enterprises that have an annual gross volume of sales made or business done of 500,000, or more, and certain other businesses. So the 500,000 of revenue threshold is an important one for this particular rule. Let's see here, looking for more questions that I can field. What are the pros and the cons of the new regulation? I think that's a particularly good question. So why what are the pros and cons? So the pros, it manages the salary threshold erosion to date and sets up a provision to prevent future erosion. So that's a particularly important one for workers. As you can see, the 400 some odd dollars a week, that wasn't, really worker friendly, and it eroded quite a bit over the time that it was sort of revisited. So that's a pro. It addresses the gap in median income, experienced by certain groups. It could benefit women and minorities in the workplace. That's obviously always a hot topic in the U.S. in particular. The regulations could promote better company behavior in paying overtime. Ambiguity on employee classification, which we talked about the number of workers being affected by this new rule. That ambiguity can be a really difficult spot for people to be in. The biggest con is the increase in overtime costs if hours are not effectively managed, and not that rate of cost. But what about labor litigation? Now complying with the possible increase in labor litigation. So that's something to keep an eye out for. Okay, we have a question here about the salary threshold and how to explain it. And so going back to sort of the presentation, maybe Vivek and Parthosh, we could go back to one of the early slides that talked about the three criteria. Yeah. So before the salary test portion of whether a worker is exempt or not exempt, now it's effectively more than double to $913 per week. So for the portion of determining, whether the salary portion, the threshold, as to if you were $55 per week, you would qualify for exempt status. But now that threshold has doubled to $913 per week, or over $47,000 annually, to qualify for exempt. So now, to basically qualify as an exempt employee, $47,000 or above is the threshold for that particular portion of the test. But the other thing about that is, once again, that threshold is going to be revisited every 3 years. So while it's relevant today, it's going to be different 3 years from now. Okay, we have a question here from the line. Can you just raise the worker's salary above the new threshold to avoid paying overtime, or would you also have to maybe look at all three to the three criteria? It's still the salary level test, but don't forget the salary basis test, which is to say that if you're paid and it's for a certain number of hours that you 40 hours, that person could still be a non-exempt employee. And on top of that, the duties test still should you have questions about those specific three tests and there's some subjectivity, we do recommend that you talk to your legal counsel about specific individual cases, but you have to look at all three. Okay, we have a question around if someone is an exempt employee and makes less than the minimum requirement, we still need to pay overtime. Is this correct? Under the new thresholds, yeah. So if someone is currently exempt and makes less than the minimum requirement, because of the change in thresholds, you have to revisit, and that if they're below the threshold, so you do have to revisit if they're below the thresholds. Are there any guidelines for the duties testers who believe the exercise decisions than they actually do? This one is tough. I mean, so this is objectivity around this duties test. I mean, in general, the duties test is around, does the employer, or does the employee have influence over others' exempt, non-exempt status? And that on a case-by-case basis. That's not a simple one, and that is one that we, recommend that you basis and connect with, your legal counsel or whoever's appropriate within your company, because the duties test is the one that's sort of is the most subjective. So take a look at that one. But in general, if someone has influence over other employees' status, they're part of that duties test and would be exempt provided they meet the other two guidelines. Okay, we have another about 5 minutes here. Looks like we have other questions. So here's one around, besides payroll costs, what other business implications will there be from the new overtime rules? Okay, I can take a stab at that. So this depends on the company, but at a high level, here are some of the implications. Basically, there does need to be a technology assessment and implementation of time tracking systems, especially if you're working with workers in multiple states, remote workforces, et cetera. But that's something that needs to be visited. I would do that well in advance of December 1st. Training and communication when it comes to using the time tracking, understanding the new overtime rules, and communicating the impact to everyone in your organization. Cannot emphasize that point enough. When people are confused and don't know, be sort of antsy about their status, and could expose you to more litigation, those types of things. The employee benefits and compensation and recruitment issue, that will have implications on your business. So if someone is reclassified as hourly, they could no longer receive it. Remember, because it works both ways, they could no longer receive mandatory benefits such as dental and disability. And so the overall cost of compensating an employee could also impact your overall recruitment and staffing budget, especially as you spread out work across more workers. And employee morale as a result could be affected. So if you reclassify some people to hourly, that could be viewed as a demotion, but whereas you could just be making a business decision, and your cost structure could be dramatically affected by these new rules. How do you position that to employees, and how do you convey to an employee that they're not going to result of the changing thresholds? With your legal counsel on this. And it could also change the career trajectory as a result of some of these employees. If you get reclassified from exempt to non-exempt, what implications does that have overall on people who are really, really great, can no longer trajectory as a result of their changing status? We have a question around, how does the exemption status change for those who make under the threshold? So similar to a question that we that we addressed earlier around exempt versus non-exempt, if they no longer meet the salary level test for exempt, they are now non-exempt employees. So the threshold, under the new threshold starting December 1st, you're going to have some business decisions to make, and then of course you're going to have to look at the other criteria around this rule. But that's something that every company on this call is going to have to look at. We have a very good question around, what can businesses do to avoid becoming a target around employee lawsuit or Department of Labor audit under the new regulations? That's an excellent question. Again, it's critical that employees have accurate hourly data and a clear audit trail for the hours their employees have worked for a few reasons. I mean, you want accurate time data because as a result of the new regulations, employers will have to pay their salaried employees who are below the new threshold for any overtime hours worked. Payroll automation is a big one, so applying pay rules consistently and accurately can be a big challenge. Automation can reduce these errors, costs, and litigations. The audit trail, once again, if an employee reports to your organization, for your organization is not following the new regulations, the Department of Labor, you can almost guarantee it, will audit your business. And historical information for business intelligence. So as you consider how you handle each employee's labor situation, you need to have accurate employee time data because this will affect the hard business you're going to have to make going forward. The amount of hours they currently work directly impacts how you choose to handle their compensation. And I see that Parthosh and Vivek are cycling through a couple of slides here just to give you a flavor and refresh you. By the way, we will send this presentation out to all of you as part of this, so don't worry. We only have 2 minutes left on this particular webinar, but we're not going to leave you high and dry. We're going to reach out to each of you individually. We have a question around one of my employees makes $2,884 weekly. Is he classified as exempt? Should I be paying him overtime? Based on the thresholds under the new rules, well above the 913 per week as called for by the new threshold. So that was a very specific and tactical question. It looks like you're okay based on the salary level. However, you do need to still look at the other two pieces of the test, right? Which is are they being paid for that work, for a certain number of hours per week, and what are their duties? So I would still encourage you to look at all three pieces of that test and make sure that there's no subjectivity around that. It looks like we're down to 1 minute left, so we don't have time for this time. However, you can expect to hear from someone from Replicon individually who will reach out to you, get your feedback on the webinar. I really want to thank everyone for attending today. We had a huge attendance on this one, so there's a lot of interest in the subject. So we want to thank you. Expect to hear from us individually through some of this stuff. And of course, if you're interested in a solution about that, it's us or someone else, your business, it's going to have a dramatic impact before the end of the year. So look forward to connecting to each of you individually. Thank you for your time. Sunil.rajaraman@replicon.com if you have any specific questions for me. Thank you for your time. Look forward to connecting soon. With that, we will conclude the webinar.